What modern historians call early Christianity wasn't genuine Christianity. Genuine Christianity was the first century covenant movement within Israel that proclaimed the Messiah and addressed Israel's imminent covenant crisis under the law. It was a message directed to the people who stood within that covenant framework, those bound to the law, its promises, and its curses, and it announced that the resolution of that covenant story was unfolding in their own generation. What later developed under the name Christianity was something very different. A post-first century religious system that universalized a message originally tied to Israel's historical covenant situation and extended it far beyond the audience and time frame the New Testament writers were addressing. Church fathers, complete fakes. They were not participants in the original first century covenant crisis that the New Testament addressed. They were writers from the second century and later living after the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the Mosaic covenant order in AD 70. By that time, the historical setting that gave rise to the New Testament message had already passed. As a result, their writings reflect a developing post-Jewish Greco-Roman religious movement that was attempting to interpret earlier texts and traditions within a very different cultural and historical context. Because of that shift, many of the church fathers began to universalize ideas that were originally tied to Israel's covenant story, and they reinterpreted the New Testament through philosophical and theological frameworks that were common in the wider Greco-Roman world. This is why their writings often sound quite different from the first century texts themselves. They were not eyewitnesses to the covenant crisis described in the New Testament, nor were they participants in the historical situation that produced those writings. For that reason, the Church Fathers are historically interesting as evidence of how the movement evolved after the first century, but their interpretations do not necessarily define what the earliest message originally meant. They represent a later stage in the development of the religion, not the original context in which the New Testament message was delivered.